April 1945, somewhere near the Rhine. The war was ending, but for the women standing in the mud outside a barbed wire enclosure, it didn't feel like victory or defeat. It felt like the end of the world. German nurses, their white armbands stained brown with weeks of field dust and blood, stood silently as U.S. Army trucks rumbled past. The sound of engines mixed with the distant echo of artillery, a reminder that somewhere east men were still dying. These women had tended to them only days ago. Now they were prisoners. They expected shouting, humiliation, maybe worse. The propaganda they'd grown up with had painted the Americans as savages, vengeful and cruel. Many whispered prayers under their breath as the camp gates opened. Then something unexpected happened. An American guard, young, sunburned, weary, raised his hand not to strike but to salute. He nodded toward them with quiet respect. The women froze. Confusion turned to disbelief. No one spoke. In that moment, the image of the enemy fractured, replaced by something human, something they had been told no longer existed in war. To understand how that simple gesture became unforgettable, we must go back to the final months of the war. By early 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. From the eastern plains of Poland to the forests of western Germany, the front lines were retreating faster than the wounded could be moved. What had once been a sprawling military machine was now a desperate collection of broken divisions, makeshift field hospitals, and overrun convoys. Among the chaos were the German military nurses, women who had been trained under the Red Cross or the Wehrmacht's medical corps. Many were barely in their 20s, assigned to mobile hospitals that followed retreating units across ruined landscapes. They worked in tents lit by flickering lamps, dressing wounds while artillery thundered in the distance. Morphine was scarce, bandages improvised, and every ambulance that moved westward carried not just the injured, but also fragments of a crumbling nation. For these women, the front was no longer a line, it was everywhere. The Luftwaffe no longer owned the skies. The Wehrmacht no longer controlled the roads. Soviet and Allied forces pressed in from both sides. The nurses' mission was simple but brutal. Keep the wounded alive long enough to surrender or die humanely. Many had been indoctrinated since girlhood. Nazi propaganda portrayed them as symbols of purity and sacrifice, the white angels of the Reich. Posters showed serene faces tending to soldiers beneath the swastika, a comforting lie hiding the blood-soaked truth. The regime glorified their duty, but when defeat loomed, that same regime abandoned them. By March 1945, American units advancing through the Rhineland began to encounter German medical detachments retreating in disarray. Some still carried stretchers, others drove commandeered farm carts filled with the wounded. To U.S. soldiers, these first encounters were surreal. The enemy was supposed to be armed men, not exhausted women in torn uniforms marked with fading red crosses. The U.S. Army had clear rules. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, medical personnel were to be treated as non-combatants. Yet on the battlefield, theory and reality often collided. Many American soldiers had lost friends to relentless German resistance only days earlier. Emotions were raw. Seeing enemy nurses stirred a strange mix of anger, curiosity, and pity. Still, the discipline held. Reports from units such as the 104th Infantry Division and the 3rd Armored Division describe orderly surrenders. Nurses lined up beside the wounded, hands raised, surrendering medical bags instead of rifles. Some cried, some refused to speak. One U.S. lieutenant later recalled, "They looked more like ghosts than enemies." In the background, the Reich's command structure was dissolving. Communication lines had broken down, supply routes were lost, and high command cared little for the fate of its medical staff. Many nurses received no orders at all. When capture became inevitable, they chose to stay with their patients rather than flee. It was a decision that spoke to something beyond politics, a sense of duty that transcended ideology. The Americans who guarded them soon realized these women were not the fanatical followers the propaganda had promised. They were tired, frightened, and deeply uncertain about what awaited them. Rumors spread through the German ranks that Allied troops executed female auxiliaries on sight, lies crafted to fuel fear and obedience. Every step toward captivity felt like walking into darkness. As U.S. convoys moved westward, makeshift prisoner enclosures filled rapidly. German men were separated into ranks and regiments while medical staff, particularly women, were kept apart. There was confusion even among American officers about how to classify them. Were they nurses or soldiers? Prisoners or protected personnel? Despite the uncertainty, one fact became clear. These women would not be mistreated. The U.S. Army, still reeling from its own combat trauma, enforced strict discipline in handling POWs. It was not compassion alone, but a conscious assertion of moral order. In a war defined by atrocities, small acts of restraint became statements of civilization. For the captured nurses, this first stage of surrender was filled with disbelief. They had lived through months of propaganda that dehumanized the enemy. Yet here they were, being handed food, blankets, and in some cases treated by American medics for frostbite and exhaustion. It was not friendship. It was not forgiveness, but it was respect, the one thing they never expected to find behind barbed wire. And as word spread among the camps that the Americans were not monsters, something within the prisoners began to shift, a slow, quiet unlearning of everything the Reich had taught them about the world beyond its borders. But before these women could understand this new reality, the machinery of Allied occupation had to take shape, an organized system that would determine how millions of Germans, including their medical corps, were to be held, questioned, and judged. When the Third Reich finally imploded in April and May 1945, the Western Allies faced a task no army had ever undertaken before: the control, housing, and classification of millions of surrendered German troops and personnel. Among them were thousands of female nurses and medical assistants, captured alongside combat units or discovered in makeshift hospitals scattered through the rubble of Western Europe. The United States Army moved swiftly to impose order. Under the authority of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, a vast network of prisoner-of-war enclosures, PWEs, spread across France, Belgium, and Germany itself. Each was designed to handle tens of thousands of captives. Most were open-air compounds, fenced fields under guard, where food and sanitation were minimal but structured. Within these camps, the U.S. military established separate sections for medical staff, clergy, and non-combatant auxiliaries. German women who had served as Wehrmacht-Helferinnen, female auxiliaries, or Rotkreuz-Schwestern, Red Cross nurses, fell into a gray category. The Geneva Convention recognized them as protected personnel, but their affiliation with the Nazi war machine made classification delicate. American officers, guided by the Judge Advocate General's directives, were ordered to treat them in accordance with medical status until proven otherwise. That phrase meant, in practical terms, they were to be respected as medical staff, not enemy soldiers. To many of the U.S. Guards, this was more than just a legal technicality. It was a moral statement. The Americans had marched through towns where civilians hung white sheets from windows, signaling surrender. They had seen atrocities left behind by the SS, and yet, when they looked across the wire and saw nurses tending to wounded men with makeshift bandages, a sense of shared humanity cut through the bitterness. In several camps, U.S. medical officers even requisitioned captured German nurses to assist in treating both Allied and Axis prisoners. At PWE 26 near Rennes and Camp Lucky Strike in France, records show German medical personnel working under American supervision, cleaning wounds and helping distribute medicine. It was a pragmatic decision. Manpower was stretched thin and the Americans valued competence over ideology. But for the German women, the experience was disorienting. They had been raised under a regime that defined enemies as subhuman. Now they were cooperating with them in saving lives. Interrogations were gentle compared to what many had feared. The Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, and Medical Corps officers questioned them mainly about logistics, locations of hospitals, supply routes, and lists of the wounded. The tone was formal, even polite. Some nurses reportedly broke down in tears, not from fear, but from relief that they would not be executed or humiliated. Word of this treatment spread rapidly through the prisoner network. German soldiers, accustomed to believing their women would be violated or mistreated, were astonished when they saw them walking unharmed through camp gates or receiving rations from the same kitchens. One American colonel wrote, "They expected hatred and instead found order." That alone broke something in them. The contrast was especially stark when compared to reports filtering in from the Eastern Front. Stories of Soviet revenge, forced labor, and abuse terrified those who had once believed in Germany's invincibility. Against that backdrop, American restraint seemed almost incomprehensible. To the captured nurses, it was as if they had stepped from one moral universe into another. Still, their position remained fragile. Though technically non-combatants, many were interrogated for any affiliation with SS medical units, particularly those attached to concentration camps or Waffen-SS divisions. Some were cleared quickly. Others faced months of uncertainty. But even then, treatment remained within the boundaries of respect. American policy, driven by General Eisenhower's insistence on discipline, forbade acts of vengeance or humiliation. For many of the guards, this adherence to principle became personal. They too were exhausted, veterans of the Ardennes, Aachen, and the Hürtgen Forest. They had seen death beyond imagination, and yet, as one private from the 9th Infantry Division recalled, it felt right to be decent. Maybe it was the only thing left that made us different from them. The atmosphere within these camps was unlike any other in the war. The women, still wearing the remnants of their uniforms, kept strict routines, cleaning wounds, organizing their tents, maintaining military order even in captivity. They were disciplined, courteous, and often proud, but beneath that surface lay quiet confusion. Some could not reconcile the reality before them with years of indoctrination. For the Americans, too, it was a lesson in contradiction. The enemy could wear a swastika and still act with compassion. The idea unsettled and humbled many. As the weeks passed and the chaos of surrender gave way to the structured calm of occupation, the initial shock of survival began to fade. What remained was reflection, silent questions about morality, humanity, and what it meant to fight a civilized war. Each encounter between captor and captive revealed a different side of humanity, small, fragile, and yet powerful enough to endure even the ruins of Europe. By the summer of 1945, the guns had fallen silent, but within the barbed wire of Allied camps, the war's most unexpected moral encounters continued. For the German nurses, every day behind the fence was a slow awakening, a dismantling of what they had been taught to believe. For the Americans guarding them, it was a quiet test of conscience, the human angle. The human dimension of this story begins not in policy, but in the silent gestures exchanged between those on opposite sides of war. When the first groups of German nurses arrived at POW enclosures, the atmosphere was heavy with fear. They stood in line, eyes fixed on the ground, waiting for the punishment they were certain would come. But instead, the U.S. guards handed them canteens of water and blankets. A few even offered cigarettes, a universal currency of comfort in wartime. For the women, these small acts cut deeper than any lecture or interrogation. They had braced themselves for humiliation. Instead, they found discipline and a strange form of kindness. Some refused to believe it. Others wept quietly in disbelief. Letters written weeks later, preserved in Red Cross archives, described a dignity we did not think possible. In those early days of captivity, hunger and exhaustion often blurred the line between dream and reality. Many nurses still wore the insignia of the Reich on their collars. Yet the Americans never demanded they remove it, not out of sympathy but out of indifference. To the guards, those symbols meant nothing now. To the women, that indifference itself was transformative. For years they had lived under a system where every symbol defined loyalty or death. Suddenly, none of it mattered. The cultural angle behind the fences. Two worlds collided, not just enemy nations, but entire cultures shaped by different ideals of discipline, gender, and authority. In Germany, the nursing corps was built upon obedience. Women were expected to serve, not to question. The Reich's ideology fused medicine with nationalism, teaching that healing the wounded soldier was an act of patriotic duty. The American worldview could not have been more different. In U.S. military culture, especially among medics, the emphasis lay on individual humanity. A wounded man, enemy or ally, there was a patient first. The American nurses and medics stationed near POW enclosures practiced that code, often treating German prisoners without hesitation. The captured German women watched this with astonishment. For them, mercy had always been conditional, defined by the regime's racial and political boundaries. Language barriers added to the strangeness. Few spoke fluent English. Commands were translated through interpreters, yet gestures and tone carried meaning far beyond words. The American guards often addressed them with miss or ma'am, simple courtesies that disarmed more effectively than any weapon. It was respect without ideology, something absent from years of totalitarian conditioning. For the younger American soldiers, many barely out of their teens, seeing German women in uniform was itself disorienting. They had grown up on propaganda films depicting the enemy as monstrous. Now the enemy looked human, exhausted and afraid. A few guards admitted later that this realization changed how they saw the entire war. "They looked like our sisters," one veteran later recalled. "That's when I understood why wars have to end." The moral angle, the moral undercurrent of these encounters ran deep. Every American guard knew of the atrocities committed under the same flag those nurses had served. Some had walked through the concentration camps newly liberated, Dachau, Buchenwald, Nordhausen, and seen the horror firsthand. It would have been easy to let hatred rule, yet many chose not to. This restraint was not forgiveness. It was a deliberate act of control, a refusal to descend into the same moral abyss. The U.S. command enforced it strictly. Any mistreatment of POWs, male or female, was punishable by court-martial. The guards knew that discipline was the line separating civilization from chaos. In those months, respect became a weapon of a different kind, a moral counterstrike against the inhumanity that had defined the war. By treating their captives with decency, the Americans were, consciously or not, making a statement that victory did not require vengeance. For the German nurses, this realization came slowly. Some remained defiant, clinging to pride in their service. Others began to question everything: the speeches, the propaganda, the years of conditioning that had promised an eternal Reich. When they saw American medics treat wounded Germans and Allied soldiers side by side, it shattered the ideological wall built within them. Inside those fences, amid hunger and loss, something profoundly human began to stir. It was not friendship nor even reconciliation. It was simply the recognition that the enemy could still possess honor. By the time summer turned to autumn, thousands of German medical personnel had passed through Allied custody, each left with memories that defied every expectation they had carried into the war. But the story did not end with compassion alone. Beneath the calm routines of camp life, deeper psychological and ethical conflicts were unfolding. Questions about guilt, identity, and the meaning of mercy in a world that had lost all innocence. The psychological angle inside the quiet, ordered world of the POW camps. A different kind of battle unfolded. One not fought with guns or orders, but with memory and conscience. For many German nurses, captivity became a confrontation with the self. The silence of the camps left too much room for thought. Without the noise of war, they began to reflect on what they had seen and what they had believed. Some had tended to soldiers who spoke openly of atrocities on the Eastern Front. Others had treated civilians caught in bombings, realizing too late that the Reich's total war had consumed its own people. Now under American guard, those memories returned like ghosts. The women wrote in journals, fragments of guilt and confusion. One nurse from Cologne recorded, "We were told we were serving Germany, but when I saw their hospitals, their medicine, their food, I realized we had been starving not only in body but in truth." The psychological shift was profound. Fear slowly gave way to introspection. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted surrender as shameful, capture as dishonor. Yet here, under a system that valued discipline over cruelty, they experienced something unfamiliar: safety. That alone became disorienting. Some prisoners began volunteering for camp duties, cleaning, organizing, even assisting American medics. To be useful again gave them purpose, but it also forced them to confront the humanity of their captors. The Americans, too, were not immune to the psychological weight of this reversal. Many guards were young men who had fought bitterly against German soldiers only weeks earlier. Now they found themselves protecting those same enemies, feeding them, ensuring their safety. It blurred the moral lines of war. Yet within that blur they found something restorative. Treating an enemy with respect gave meaning to their victory. It reaffirmed that decency had survived the carnage. Propaganda versus reality. The collapse of the Reich exposed the grand deception that had shaped an entire generation. Nazi broadcasts had long warned that Allied soldiers would show no mercy, that surrender meant humiliation or death. In women's training schools, this was repeated endlessly. The enemy will defile you. Better to die than to fall into their hands. When those same women were met with respectful conduct, the psychological impact was staggering. It wasn't just relief. It was disbelief that turned into quiet cognitive shock. The entire structure of fear built by the Nazi state, its justifications for total loyalty and sacrifice, crumbled overnight. Red Cross observers visiting U.S. camps in late 1945 noted a consistent pattern in their reports. German medical personnel expressed surprise at the fairness of treatment. Some requested English lessons. Others asked about the American Red Cross, curious how it functioned so differently from their own militarized system. One U.S. officer wrote, "They had been told we were beasts. Now they cannot understand why we act like men." This rupture between propaganda and reality became one of the war's quietest victories. Without speeches or flags, the Allies had dismantled one of Nazism's most powerful weapons: fear. The sight of a captured nurse being saluted rather than degraded became a living contradiction to the ideology that had justified so much hate. The ethical angle. The ethics of respect in wartime is never simple. Even within the American ranks, debates emerged. Some soldiers resented the humane treatment of their former enemies, especially after seeing liberated concentration camps. They asked, why show mercy to those who showed none? But higher command understood the stakes. The moral legitimacy of the Allied victory depended not only on defeating tyranny, but on refusing to imitate it. Eisenhower's directives emphasized that justice would be delivered through law, not vengeance. That meant maintaining humanity, even toward those who had served under the Nazi banner. In this light, the treatment of German nurses became a small but powerful example of ethical strength. Their captors' behavior reflected the broader ideals the Allies claimed to fight for: order, rule of law, and the inherent worth of human life. Every act of decency toward a prisoner was a reaffirmation of civilization itself. For the nurses, it was a lesson written not in ideology, but in conduct. Their captors' calm professionalism forced them to see beyond the symbols of war. Over time, many came to respect the Americans not as victors, but as men who had retained something sacred: moral restraint. Ethics also worked in quieter ways. Some U.S. medics privately admitted that treating German women with care was a form of redemption, a way to reclaim their own humanity after months of killing. The war had brutalized everyone. Compassion became a way back. By the end of 1945, the encounters between German nurses and their American guards had taken on a quiet rhythm, no longer defined by fear, but by a mutual, unspoken recognition. They could not undo the war nor forgive its crimes, but in their small world of tents, infirmaries, and fenced fields, they had achieved something almost revolutionary: dignity without allegiance. Each salutation, each shared cigarette, each medical gesture between former enemies became a small defiance against the ideology that had tried to erase humanity from warfare. But even this fragile peace would soon face its greatest test when interrogation, cooperation, and the politics of occupation collided in ways neither side could anticipate. By the autumn of 1945, the war in Europe was officially over. Hitler was dead, Germany lay in ruins, and the Allied occupation had begun to solidify. Yet behind the fences of U.S. prisoner enclosures, a quieter kind of transformation was reaching its height. For the German nurses, captivity had shifted from fear to uncertainty, and now to purpose. Their turning point began not with speeches or orders, but with a shortage of hands. The U.S. Army's medical divisions were overwhelmed. Tens of thousands of prisoners required treatment, from infected wounds to malnutrition. Allied hospitals were at capacity. Across France, Belgium, and Western Germany, American doctors found themselves facing an unexpected truth. They needed help, and the most skilled people available were their prisoners. Under the Geneva Convention, captured medical personnel could be asked to continue their duties, provided they did so voluntarily. In September 1945, authorization came through from SHAEF headquarters. Qualified German nurses could assist in POW medical wards under American supervision. It was a decision both practical and symbolic, one that would blur the lines between enemy and ally more completely than any armistice. At first, the idea met hesitation from both sides. Some American guards were wary. They had seen too much deceit, Too many booby-trapped surrender flags. Too many uniforms hiding fanatics. Meanwhile, the nurses themselves were torn between pride and survival. To work for their captors felt like betrayal. To refuse meant helpless idleness. Yet when the first volunteers stepped forward, the effect rippled through the camps. The scene repeated itself across multiple enclosures. In Camp Lucky Strike near Le Havre, American officers escorted a small group of German nurses to a converted field hospital tent. The smell of antiseptic filled the air. The patients inside were German POWs, suffering from infection and exposure. Without ceremony, the women began their work, cleaning wounds, taking temperatures, changing bandages. An American medic observed quietly, clipboard in hand. Something remarkable happened that day. The air of suspicion slowly dissolved into the rhythm of routine. Medicine became a bridge where ideology lost its meaning. Within hours, the Americans realized that these women were not only competent, but meticulous, products of rigorous German medical training. And for the nurses, the simple act of caring again, of saving rather than surviving, restored a sense of identity they thought lost forever. It was here, in the intimacy of hospital tents and infirmaries, that the first true exchange between victors and vanquished occurred. A shared language of medicine replaced politics. When an American sergeant offered one nurse a clean bandage roll, she hesitated, unsure if it was permitted. He smiled and said softly, "For the wounded, not for the uniform." She understood. That moment captured what history often overlooks: the quiet human revolutions that follow wars. No peace treaty can legislate compassion, yet in these hospitals it happened naturally. Reports from the U.S. Army Medical Department in late 1945 mentioned dozens of such collaborations. At PWE 29 near Chartres, a team of 12 German nurses worked side by side with American medics treating prisoners suffering from dysentery. At another site in Reims, they assisted in childbirth for German women displaced by the fighting. The Americans supplied medicine. The Germans supplied discipline and calm. For many U.S. officers, these scenes left a deep impression. They had been taught to despise the Nazi system, but now they saw individuals, tired, grieving, skilled professionals trying to do what they had always done: preserve life. One captain wrote in his field report, "They served the Reich, yes, but in the end, they served humanity." Yet beneath this fragile cooperation, a tension persisted. Each encounter carried an invisible moral question. Could compassion exist without forgiveness? The Americans were careful not to blur lines. No friendships were permitted, no fraternization allowed. Every act of courtesy remained professional, measured. But even within those boundaries, something profound was taking place. The German nurses began to shed their fear. They learned English words: bandage, needle, medicine. They began to understand the humor, the informality of their American counterparts, so unlike the rigid hierarchy of the Wehrmacht. It felt alien at first, even improper, but soon it became a form of emotional relief, a small taste of freedom even behind fences. Not all encounters went smoothly. There were moments of coldness, suspicion, even quiet resentment. Some guards refused to look at them, haunted by the memory of fallen friends. Some American nurses viewed them with contempt, seeing in their uniforms the shadow of ideology. But as the weeks passed, these barriers weakened under the constant pressure of shared duty. For the captured women, this cooperation became their salvation, not only physically, but psychologically. To be respected even under guard was to reclaim their worth. One nurse later wrote in her post-war testimony, "They took away our weapons but not our dignity." That was the true defeat, and also, strangely, our redemption. By late autumn, U.S. Command recognized the unexpected success of these integrated wards. Efficiency improved, morale steadied, and discipline remained intact. The collaboration had not undermined authority. It had reinforced it. The Americans had proven that humanity, when enforced by principle, was stronger than hatred. But this newfound understanding would soon reach its most delicate test. As the occupation deepened and interrogations grew more probing, the nurses' cooperation placed them at a moral crossroads, torn between duty to truth and loyalty to those who once commanded them. The next chapter of their captivity would no longer be about survival or service, but about trust. And what happens when the line between compassion and confession begins to blur? As 1946 approached, the war's silence grew heavier than its gunfire had ever been. Cities still smoldered, borders were redrawn, and in the American occupation zones, the prisons turned into something more complex than cages. They became classrooms, hospitals, and moral laboratories. Inside these enclosures, the German women who had once served the Reich now found themselves serving humanity, and in doing so, confronting their own reflection. The American officers had begun to notice it too, the subtle but undeniable shift in atmosphere. The prisoners no longer carried the same haunted stiffness. Their steps were measured, their heads slightly higher. Some had begun to write diaries, others helped catalog medical supplies or organize patient records. The barbed wire still stood, but within its boundaries, something like civilization was quietly returning. Yet with this change came deeper moral questions. When compassion and cooperation became daily routines, where did accountability fit in? Could someone who had served under the Nazi banner truly claim innocence, even if their hands had healed rather than harmed? These questions did not remain abstract for long. They came alive through a single, pivotal event. In early 1946, at a U.S. medical compound near Darmstadt, a German nurse named Hilda Wagner was summoned to testify. She had been in charge of a field hospital under the Wehrmacht in 1944, where wounded soldiers, and occasionally partisans, were treated. The Americans needed details for post-war war crimes investigations, and her name appeared in several documents. When Hilda entered the interrogation room, she was no longer the frightened captive who had once refused to meet the guard's eyes. She walked calmly, her uniform neat, her face expressionless. Sitting across from her was Captain Robert Allen, the same man who had once supplied her medical kits and who had, months earlier, defended her unit's right to continue nursing duties under American oversight. The tension in that room was quiet but palpable. For months, Allen had seen her as a nurse, efficient, disciplined, gentle with patients. Now he had to see her as a potential witness and, or worse, an accomplice. The questioning began politely but grew heavier. Names of officers, hospital locations, dates of evacuations. At one point, Allen asked, "Did you ever receive orders to deny treatment to non-German wounded?" Hilda froze. She had once, in late 1944, when supplies ran short. But disobeying those orders had saved 2 foreign prisoners' lives. Her memory flashed, bandaging a young French partisan's chest wound in secret, whispering to him to stay quiet as SS officers patrolled the corridor. She took a breath. "Yes," she said softly. "The order was given, but I disobeyed." Allen watched her in silence. He could see that this was not rehearsed. It was confession, not defense. He simply nodded and wrote something down. That testimony became a small footnote in the paperwork of post-war justice. But for those who witnessed it, it marked something larger. It showed that these women were not passive cogs in a machine. They had made choices, dangerous, moral, human choices, in a world where obedience had been everything. Stories like Hilda's spread quietly across the POW system. Each one chipped away at the monolithic idea of the enemy. American officers began to understand that many of these women had been trapped in the same machinery of fear that had consumed their nation. They were not soldiers of ideology, but captives of circumstance. By spring 1946, several camps began transitioning their female POWs to civilian labor status, a step toward eventual release. Those who had worked in medical or humanitarian roles were often the first considered. It was not mercy. It was logic. The war needed to rebuild, and these women carried skills that Europe could no longer afford to waste. Even so, the emotional bond between captors and captives had to remain unspoken. The Americans were under strict orders. No fraternization, no correspondence, no contact after repatriation. Yet many guards found it difficult to erase what they had experienced. A quiet respect lingered, a recognition that in the ruins of war, humanity had somehow survived. When the first release orders came in May 1946, the scene was unlike the chaos of capture a year earlier. There were no shouts, no hatred, no triumph. The same trucks that had once brought prisoners to the camp now carried them toward uncertain freedom. At the gate, a few American medics stood in line, watching silently. One nurse turned before stepping onto the truck. Not to wave, not to speak, but simply to nod. The gesture mirrored the one she had received the day of her capture, that first salute of respect from an American soldier. It was the circle closing, the war folding into memory. In her post-war letters preserved decades later, Hilda would write, "The Americans did not free us with keys, but with dignity. I learned that mercy can be a discipline, and discipline can be a mercy." It was a sentiment echoed by many. In a time when vengeance could have been the easy choice, restraint had proven to be the greater power. The U.S. Army's treatment of female POWs, though rarely celebrated, became one of the quiet triumphs of decency amid devastation. By the end of 1946, most of the German female medical personnel held by U.S. forces had been repatriated. Many returned to shattered homes, families gone, reputations uncertain, but they carried something the ruins could not erase: the memory of fairness, of being seen not as monsters, but as people who could still choose compassion. And for the Americans who guarded them, it was a lesson that would linger for life. War had taught them how to fight. Captivity had taught them how to remain human. What began as imprisonment had become a mirror, one that reflected the best and worst of both sides, and the fragile, enduring line between them. The spring of 1946 felt strangely quiet across the ruins of Germany. The thunder of artillery had faded, replaced by the echo of footsteps on broken streets. For many, the silence was unbearable, a sound that reminded them of what was lost. But for those who had survived captivity under American control, that silence also carried something rare in post-war Europe: the weight of gratitude. In the months following their release, hundreds of German nurses and female auxiliaries began the long journey home. Trains, stripped of windows and seats, carried them through landscapes still scarred by bomb craters and burned-out villages. Every station stop brought new reminders: Red Cross tents filled with refugees, Allied soldiers patrolling rubble-choked streets, and German civilians trading bread for scraps of news. Among them was Hilda Wagner, her nurse's satchel still intact, though she no longer had patients to tend. She had written a single letter before boarding the transport: "To the men who guarded us with respect, we will not forget." The letter never reached its destination. It didn't need to. It existed for herself, a memory sealed in words. The women returning home found that the war had left no space for sentimentality. Many faced suspicion, even hostility. "You worked for them," some neighbors whispered, unable to distinguish between service and survival. Others saw them as relics of a lost regime. Few wanted to hear about American fairness or kindness. It clashed with the bitterness of defeat. Yet quietly, these women carried their stories forward. They spoke of rationed meals shared equally, of American guards who treated them like professionals, not prisoners, of moments when humanity broke through the cold machinery of occupation. And in post-war Germany, a country drowning in shame and reconstruction, such stories mattered. They showed that mercy could coexist with justice, that decency could emerge even in victory. For the U.S. Army, these experiences did not go unnoticed. Reports circulated among military leadership about the unexpected discipline and professionalism of the female POWs. In 1947, internal assessments by the Office of Military Government noted that female German medical personnel have shown exceptional reliability and work ethic under supervision. Some were even temporarily rehired under Allied authority. For medical aid programs, especially in hospitals where staff shortages had become critical, the idea that former enemy nurses could help heal a defeated nation was both practical and symbolic. It reflected the shift from wartime destruction to reconstruction, from punishment to partnership. America was preparing for a different kind of campaign now: the rebuilding of Europe and the moral rehabilitation of a continent. Still, not all Americans approved. Letters home from guards revealed mixed emotions. Some wrote of admiration, others of guilt. A sergeant from the 71st Infantry Division confessed to his wife, "It feels wrong to respect those we fought, but I cannot help it. They've shown courage I did not expect to find behind the wire." Such sentiments, rare but real, underscored a deeper truth. The war had ended, but the soldiers were still learning what peace meant. In the years that followed, Some of these women, including Hilda, entered civilian hospitals rebuilt with Allied aid. They worked under new flags, new administrations, but with the same quiet discipline that had once defined their wartime service. A few emigrated west, joining post-war nursing programs in France or even the United States under exchange schemes. Their pasts were rarely spoken of. Their reputations remained shadowed by the uniforms they once wore. But in moments of reflection, when the nights were long and the memories sharper than sleep, they would remember the barracks, the cold mornings, the barbed wire glistening with frost, and the guard who had nodded instead of shouting. It was not forgiveness they remembered, but recognition. By the early 1950s, as West Germany began to rise from its ruins, these stories started to surface in memoirs and interviews. They were quiet testimonies of dignity preserved amid collapse, stories that contradicted propaganda from both sides. The image of the merciful American Guard and the disciplined, unbroken German nurse became a subtle symbol of what post-war Europe was trying to become: humane, measured, capable of coexistence after catastrophe. It would take decades before historians examined these encounters closely. For years they lived only in letters, diaries, and whispered recollections. But in those fragile records lay a lesson that outlasted the war itself: that respect, even between enemies, could alter the course of memory more deeply than any victory or defeat. The war had shown humanity at its most destructive. Captivity, paradoxically, had shown its endurance, and yet the story was not over, because what happened next would reveal just how deeply this quiet decency shaped the post-war world. By the late 1940s, Germany had become a divided nation, both politically and morally. The rubble had been cleared from streets, but not from memory. While Allied tribunals in Nuremberg handed down verdicts to those responsible for atrocities, a quieter reckoning unfolded in hospitals, universities, and homes. It was the reckoning of ordinary people, including the women who had lived the paradox of compassion amid a regime built on cruelty. The American occupation authorities faced a monumental challenge: how to rebuild trust in a society that had lost faith in itself. Rehabilitation programs were introduced to denazify professional sectors: doctors, teachers, nurses. For many former Wehrmacht nurses, this meant standing before committees explaining not just their work but their conscience. Some hearings were stern, others merciful. The U.S. Army Medical Review Boards often noted no evidence of ideological conviction, classifying most nurses as followers, not perpetrators. Yet the very process forced these women to re-examine their lives under a harsh new light. They had sworn oaths to heal, but they had served under a symbol that destroyed. For women like Hilda Wagner, this period became an internal trial. She returned to her hometown in Bavaria in 1947 and applied for a nursing post at a local hospital reopened under Allied supervision. When asked in her interview about her wartime service, she replied simply, "I served the wounded. Nationality did not matter." The supervisor, a British doctor overseeing staff recruitment, later recorded her words as the most honest answer I had heard all year. She was hired on the spot. Stories like Hilda's began to weave a subtle thread of reconciliation between former enemies. American officers who had once guarded German women in prison camps found themselves coordinating medical relief efforts with them a few years later. Their shared mission, to heal a broken continent, became a bridge stronger than propaganda, stronger even than memory. The Red Cross, too, recognized the symbolic weight of these transformations. In 1949, an international nursing conference in Geneva quietly included 2 delegates from West Germany, both of whom had previously been held as POWs. One of them, Dr. Liesl Schaefer, addressed the assembly with a speech that captured the spirit of the post-war healing. The hands that once dressed the wounds of soldiers now dress the wounds of nations. Mercy, we have learned, is not weakness, it is survival. Her words earned a standing ovation. For the first time since the war, German medical workers were publicly acknowledged not as instruments of a fallen regime, but as participants in rebuilding civilization. Meanwhile, the American guards who had once watched over those women returned home with memories that shaped their lives in quiet ways. In letters preserved in U.S. archives, many reflected on how the experience had changed them. One former MP wrote, "We learned that victory is not only what you win with a rifle, but what you preserve with your restraint. Another, a young sergeant who had guarded a POW infirmary, confessed, "They were our prisoners, but they taught us something about grace. I saw courage that had nothing to do with battle." Such reflections never reached the front pages of newspapers or history textbooks. They were too quiet, too human, not the kind of stories that fit into triumphal narratives. Yet they lingered in families, journals, and small-town memories, and when historians would later uncover them, they formed a mosaic of moral complexity, a reminder that decency had survived the world's darkest hour, not through grand gestures, but through ordinary acts of respect. By 1955, when West Germany regained full sovereignty, many of these women were middle-aged professionals, nurses, caregivers, midwives, helping to rebuild hospitals across a recovering nation. Some corresponded anonymously with their former captors, exchanging simple words like, "We are well," or "Thank you for your fairness." There was no official recognition, no medals for restraint, no monuments for the kindness exchanged behind barbed wire, but perhaps none were needed. The legacy lived on in a different form, in the professionalism of a generation of nurses who taught their students that ethics were not born from ideology, but from humanity. And for the Americans, the lesson endured through the Cold War that followed, that even in victory, the true measure of civilization is how one treats the defeated. As Europe rebuilt itself from ashes, the story of those women, and their unexpected respect for and from their captors, became an unspoken testament to moral endurance. In the face of total war, they had preserved something that guns could not destroy: dignity. But even dignity to endure must find meaning. And for that, we turn to what this quiet encounter truly revealed about the nature of war, mercy, and being human. History often remembers wars by their victories and defeats, by flags raised and cities destroyed. Yet, in the quiet spaces between those moments, the true essence of humanity is revealed. The story of the German nurses and their American guards was not one of strategy or conquest. It was a story of restraint, the courage to remain decent when every instinct of war had stripped people of decency. When those women crossed the gates of captivity in 1945, they carried fear, shame, and exhaustion. What they found instead was something that no propaganda had prepared them for: respect. It was not pity. It was not forgiveness. It was recognition. The simple acknowledgement that even in defeat they were still human. That recognition mattered. Because in every war there are two kinds of victories. One fought on the battlefield and one fought in the conscience. The United States had won the first with power, but it won the second with compassion. And that second victory would last far longer. For the German nurses, those months behind barbed wire became a strange education, one that no classroom or ideology could have offered. They learned that mercy, even from an enemy, could restore a sense of worth that the war had tried to erase. They returned to their homeland carrying not hatred, but understanding, a quiet seed that would grow into the moral reconstruction of post-war Germany. And for the Americans, the lesson was equally profound. They discovered that true discipline is not only the control of arms, but the control of spirit, the ability to show respect where vengeance would be easier. In the end, the war that destroyed so much also revealed something unbreakable. Humanity, fragile, flawed, and often hidden, had endured behind fences and uniforms, surviving in gestures as small as a nod, a salute, or a kind word spoken in a language neither side fully understood. That is how history heals itself, not through treaties or trials, but through the silent choices of ordinary people who refuse to let cruelty have the final word. In a world torn apart by hatred, a single act of respect became an act of defiance, and a reminder that even in war, decency is victory.